Big Beat Manifesto goes, big beats are the best, get high all the time.
Right. At the time, it felt like a much more all-encompassing philosophy.
Yeah. This is outrageous. This is contagious.
Ron, you cretin! You're a fuckhead! That's what you are! A fucking shithead!
It was a joke, Mark. I was joking. It was a Christmas joke.
Hey everybody, you're listening to the L Dude Brothers podcast, episode 2. This is your co-host Lee.
And co-host Sean.
And welcome to the podcast. You know, it's finally March. It's my favorite time of year. Spring training's in full swing finally. Something interesting to look at.
Yeah, I'm excited for, once again, the Royals to have a good season. Kind of a little bit of a letdown last year not having any October baseball, but we'll see what happens this year.
Yeah, well, you know, you got the World Series before that, so I'm not going to cry too much for you. But certainly the Reds are due for another slog, so that's going to be fun to watch.
Well, you know, everybody thought the Royals were going to be bad, and they did okay. So,
Yeah.
you know, the Reds can't. I'm sure the Reds will do better than they did last season.
We'll certainly see. Something else I wanted to touch on here before we get started on the episode is quite interesting, and we mentioned it, the show QI, on our introduction podcast. And basically, it's a British panel show hosted by Stephen Fry, but there's actually 3 seasons of it up on Hulu now.
Oh, that's cool. I've been wanting to watch it, so the fact that it's on Hulu make that easy for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very, very entertaining, and there's a lot of cool stuff you'll learn on there. Like I said, Mitchell's a common guest, and so is Jeremy Clarkson, if you like him from the Grand Tour. But it's a great show. Definitely check it out if you are on Hulu and just looking for something else, some more David Mitchell content. It's good stuff. But without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump into the interview, which is Season 1, Episode 2 of Peep Show that aired originally on September 26, 2003. Once again, written by Jesse Armstrong and Sam Bain.
Yeah, I was really pleased with this episode. I really like this one a lot better than I like last week's episode.
Absolutely. You know, we obviously beat last week's episode to death in the podcast, and, you know, while it was a good intro, it just... that's all it really was an introduction to the characters. It starts kind of moving things in motion, and you get a little bit better feel for the characters not completely acting unlike themselves.
Yeah, one thing I like in this episode that also coincidentally made it hard to podcast about, this is our second attempt at this podcast. This episode, and just this also will serve for the fans listening, this episode features a lot of jumping around between Mark and Jeremy. They both have very parallel storylines that for about the middle third of the episode don't really intersect. So when we are discussing this episode, we'll be discussing both characters' story arcs in kind of one whole, and then when they meet back up, we'll pick up the episode as normal.
Yeah, it's going to be a little bit weird at first, but, you know, we actually recorded, 57 minutes last night, and decided it was very difficult to follow. So hopefully this will be a little bit easier, and we'll give it a shot for these kind of episodes that jump around a whole lot. But yeah, for the first scene here, you know, typical, we start off in Mark's apartment, and Mark is in his room getting ready for work, and Jeremy's waking up.
Yeah, Mark is fascinated walking around in underwear with socks on, and he's wondering to himself about, do women wear socks? Obviously, yes, Mark, they do. And then he has this little rhyme where he talks about it's okay to put your socks on before you put on your trousers, but never pants.
Yeah,
I don't know what the difference is.
Yeah, I think in, pants is underwear and trousers are pants, as we were just referring here. Yeah, so...
something like that.
Yeah, I guess he thinks it makes you look weird. But looking definitely weird is, well, I don't know if you call it weird, but we see the first ass of the show, which belongs to Jeremy. He is walking around the apartment naked, and you get one of those weird first-person urination where the whole point of view thing's a little bit strange.
I think it's funny how he's just peeing all over the toilet, and he just really doesn't care.
Yeah, well, it's because, as he mentions, and it's the first mention of his ex-girlfriend, Big Suze, who we'll meet later on in the series, but they apparently had just broken up, and he says her reign of terror is over, so obviously, he doesn't care too much about Mark having to clean it up, but that's Jeremy for you.
Yeah.
we move on to Mark in the kitchen, who's making his breakfast, which is just 2 pieces of toast, but he's very pleased with himself because he's got a piece of brown toast for his main course and white for the pudding. But the joke is on, anybody, I guess he just kind of throws it out there, that he actually secretly really likes the brown toast. And again, we're overanalyzing Mark's food, but that seems to be a theme here.
Mark does have interesting taste in food. This is just a funny little Mark scene where, a normal person would not even really think about this level of their food, but Mark just can't help but overanalyze everything.
Absolutely. He's always got that neurotic dialogue happening internally. So Mark then turns and calls Jeremy Dr. J, which is kind of strange, but
Yeah, it's really weird. Jeremy just, between peeing all over the seat of the toilet, he's gone to his room and gotten dressed, and he comes into the kitchen, and Mark just looks at him and says, "Hey, what's up, Dr. J?"
and Jeremy doesn't have a job, so he actually is thinking to himself, well, I'm just going to get a little bit of ballast in the stomach and then go back to bed, which is kind of the part of the theme of this episode. And Marks apologizes to Jeremy for not hooking up with him and Superhands the night before, which, again, a little bit strange because I don't really know why Mark would be hanging out with Jeremy and Superhands.
I don't know. It's just like calling him Dr. J. I mean, I can't think of really any time in the series where Mark would willingly hang out with Superhands.
No, I don't think so. And then the whole time, Mark's kind of pitching him, kind of buttering him up for the idea of, starting to get a job or look for a job. Meanwhile, Jeremy just kind of phases Mark out and just jams a knife into the toaster repeatedly.
Yeah, he starts talking about this looks like the Crusher from Star Wars, except red hot, and he starts talking about what he would do if his parents were trapped in there and which one he would save, and he's just completely zoning Mark out. In fact, what's really funny is that you just don't even hear what Mark is saying. It's a very funny scene, and it's a scene that happens at least one other time in this episode.
And I actually tried, because that's the whole purpose of this podcast is to analyze the episode. I actually tried to kind of pick up on Mark's audio, and it's so phased out that there's really nothing left.
Yeah, and then Jeremy just sort of snaps in, and as he snaps in, the audience snaps in on with what Mark has been saying.
Yeah. So the conversation continues in the next scene where they're in the living room actually eating their breakfast. Mark refers to the two of them as Jez and Mez, which of course Jez is a British nickname for Jeremy, but I'd never heard of Mez, and I think it's the last time that he ever refers to himself as Mez.
I don't ever remember him calling himself Mez ever again. It's a little bit funny because it's just very out of character for Mark to, be like that, but it's just one of those things. Like when I heard it the first time, I was like, Mez, what? He never refers to himself as that way ever again.
Well, it kind of makes sense here in a second. I think we'll talk about it, but they're sitting in the living room watching TV, a little bit more of that sort of Beavis and Buttheady sort of theme. And Jeremy mentions that Superhands dropped a new bass line, and it was so great that he physically couldn't turn it off, and he's super excited to get recording with Superhands again.
Yeah, and then Mark is, trying to be supportive of Jeremy's music career, where he's kind of, well, but what if the music career doesn't work out, Jeremy? And he's being very, I don't necessarily say condescending is the right. Patronizing. There you go. And he just hands Jeremy this application to JLB credit where he works. And he says, you got to interview. You need to get this faxed over to us by 3 p.m.
Yes. And in there is the first mention of the El Dude Brothers, which is obviously where we get the name of the podcast from. But the thing about the El Dude Brothers is kind of what I was saying about the whole Jez and Mez thing. The way that it always works out, you get the El Dude Brothers and then do the horn honk, which is, how we end every episode. And if you hadn't seen the series, you've probably been pretty confused up to this point, but hopefully now it makes a little bit of sense. So essentially, when they do the El Dude Brothers honk, it's usually one person that is very enthusiastic and trying to convince the other one to be enthusiastic. But, usually you get a hearty from the first guy, and then the other one's just yeah, very, reserved and unsure. So it's funny. It's a recurring theme throughout the entire series, and you get a lot of mentions of the All Dude brothers.
Yes, just like I hope we get mentions on your Facebook or Twitter feeds.
Yeah, yeah, that's wishful thinking. Certainly, I hope so too. Then they're sitting there on the couch, and Jeremy mentions that he's trying to grow as an artist with Super Hands and the band, and that everybody kind of needs what he refers to as their something stupid, which is a song, just kind of one of those cheesy love songs, and it's sort of a recurring theme in this episode as well. It's referred to at least 3 or 4 times.
Yeah, and it's a song that we'll have on the outro, but you can just hear how the characters this song really comes to life in this episode.
Absolutely, because I didn't get it the first couple times that I saw this episode, and then it started to make sense. You kind of pick it up here and there. So after you've actually heard the song, at least. So again, Mark's being way overly polite to Jeremy, and he just thinks Jeremy actually refers to him as a work shy freeloader. To which,
and then
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. After you, sir.
So in which Jeremy can only think in his head that Mark's a tight-fisted cock muncher.
I feel like this is the thesis of the entire series, and just encapsulates both characters. Like if you had to write out 3 words to describe each character, those are the perfect 3.
Yeah, I think so too. Warring factions again. So it's kind of what they do. Moving on to the next scene is actually at the JLB building where Mark works, with Jeremy still sitting at home. And this is where we're going to start kind of breaking it down and going through. So we'll talk about Mark's storyline in this scene first. You get the first appearance of the JLB building, and he goes into work and goes to his computer, and Sophie's left him a little cartoon on a sticky note stuck to his computer.
Yeah, this is super funny, and it's a very cute scene with Mark being all like excited about getting the cartoon. I also in this scene too, as Mark is going into work, he meets a kid who on all outward appearances has a limp, but Mark can't tell that he has a limp. And then when the kid only rides the elevator up to the first floor, Mark shouts at him and tells him, you're not allowed to ride the elevator to the first floor. And then the kid limps off, and Mark feels bad for yelling at a child with disabilities.
Yeah, actually, going back to Mark's history way of thinking, he says people like him should wear stickers. Oh yeah, great idea, Adolf.
He's self-aware enough to also realize that the stickers thing is something that should never be said out loud.
Absolutely. So then we see Mark and Sophie have a little interaction, and kind of again the theme between Mark and Sophie. Mark really doesn't know what to say, so he just kind of blurts out the first thing he can think of, which happens to be have a nice shower or bath.
I like that he includes the phrase "or bath." Like a normal person would say, "Oh, have a nice shower," and
a normal person wouldn't say that to begin with.
Yes, yes, you are 100% correct. That is not something a normal person would say.
Yeah.
But I'm saying if you were, like, if I was talking to my wife and I said, "Did you have a nice shower?" She took a bath, she would say, "Oh yeah, I took a bath, but yeah, it was fantastic." Like I wouldn't, if I all of a sudden just said, "Oh, did you have a nice shower?" She wouldn't be upset about it. But I like that Mark has to qualify or
Right.
bath.
That being said, if you listeners out there have ever picked a woman up by using the pickup line, have a nice shower or bath, by all means, leave a comment on our Facebook page. We'd love to hear about it.
Yes.
So it's an awkward interaction and really lays the foundation for everything that happens really with the 2 characters in the entire series. So in this episode is the only one where they give each other little flirty cartoons, which is kind of disappointing because it is kind of it's almost like 7th graders passing notes in class, kind of cute, whatever.
It's very tender. Like it really is a tender moment, and I feel like kind of a serious moment, even though it's not necessarily presented as like being super serious, but you just see that there really is like an interest between these 2 characters.
Yes, because it's not immediately obvious, I don't think, but and especially in the episodes to come, it starts to get even a little bit different. So Mark then is trying to draw his own cartoon to return to Sophie, which his first attempt is just some weird puffy shirted, weird looking guy.
He's holding flowers, and for a long time I thought it was a knife, but I'm not necessarily. I don't think it was a knife.
I
I
would,
can't tell what it is though.
well, and as much as I would doubt that, given the second cartoon that Mark draws for Sophie, maybe it could have been a knife. I don't really know because the second cartoon is two stick figures holding a heart, and Mark kind of looks at it and says, yeah, "This isn't very interesting." Basically, what would Jeremy do to kind of spice this up? To be the wild card. So, being a World War II buff, he draws a swastika inside of the heart.
And he's just so proud of himself. Yeah, crazy love, Nazi love. Love is for Nazis, and I'm sure part of him thinks that that's perfectly acceptable, but then he, it's just he's not self-aware to realize that not everybody would jump to that conclusion.
Absolutely. And, kind of just goes on Jeremy's little tangent, sort of, oh, yeah, loves for Nazis, haha. So he then takes the cartoon and goes to leave it on Sophie's computer. And this is the first time we hear somebody singing any kind of rendition of something stupid in the episode.
Yeah, Mark is walking down the hallway to Sophie's desk, and he just says, "So I go and seal the deal by doing something wicked like this cartoon," and he sings it perfectly within time with how the actual song goes.
Right, which didn't make sense to me. I always wondered why he was singing on the way to her desk, but then when you actually, again, you hear the song and then you're like, oh, okay, well, that makes more sense. I guess maybe if you're in the UK and that was a popular song, maybe it's different. But anyway, so Mark later on has a realization that Nazi love might not necessarily be a good type of love to be putting out there.
Yeah, thankfully he realizes very quickly that probably not everybody is going to understand the joke.
No, but
So he rushes back. So he rushes back to Sophie's desk to grab the cartoon.
yeah, unfortunately, the cartoon's already gone, so he's very upset with himself, starts banging his head against the wall, kind of asking himself, why would you do what Jeremy would do? Like, that's not what Mark does at all. But again, Mark has a little bit of that sort of idealization of Jeremy, I think, and, just basically says, thanks a lot, you tit, kind of blaming it on Jeremy, even though, he's the one that drew the cartoon.
Yeah.
It's a Mark thing to do.
So while we have kind of finished Mark's most of Mark's day, we're going to jump back and take a look and see what Jeremy did, and Jeremy by far has the better day, I think.
I would say so. So, and again, this is all kind of happening at the same time as Mark's storyline. It's just easier to kind of broadcast it this way. So, Superhands is going to be coming over to the apartment, and he says it's going to be about 20 minutes, which Jeremy takes as meaning that he's got about an hour to get ready.
And what would any other young 20-something man do in an hour by himself? Well, he's gonna take care of business, so to speak.
Gonna polish a dolphin.
Yep. And he's looking for a pornographic magazine. Now he decides that for whatever reason he thinks Mark would own pornography. Does Mark seem like a porn guy to you?
I mean, he's pretty desperate, but
Right.
but not I don't know, not that kind of desperate. I don't know. No. I mean, he mentioned porn to Tony, but
Yeah.
that was about it. So Jeremy just he's having a little internal monologue where Mark's got no conception. He thinks that Jeremy's lazy, doesn't do anything, but really he's busting his balls creatively, and just basically worried about getting his rent money. Or Mark is just worried about getting his rent money. Jeremy can't see the bigger picture. He's very upset that he might actually have to work a real job.
Yeah, the horror. And as his anger is building and building, he discovers an opaque yellow bag full of magazines.
Oh, yes. And inside of the yellow bag is an issue of Fantasy Figure Modeler, which actually we found out since yesterday is a real magazine.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I always thought that Fantasy Figure Modeler was kind of just a play off of White Dwarf, which is a magazine for a company called Gamers Workshop that's based out of England. So I always just assumed that Fantasy Figure Modeler was a fake magazine. Say that 3 times fast.
Mm-mm. So, naturally, Jeremy just kind of thinking about it says, Jesus, like maybe this is Mark's porn.
The look of like revulsion on his face when he realizes that his best friend, or when I guess he thinks, it's never confirmed, when he thinks that his best friend is like taking care of himself with, elves and pixies and stuff.
Right. Well, and so this is probably the best scene, at least in my opinion, of the entire episode, where Jeremy's really genuinely trying to get into the so-called porn that he's looking at, which is basically it's like a picture of a giant snake with like a sultry elf.
Yeah, she's wearing like kind of a green, well, as we've learned the words, bodkin and jerkin, with a sword around her waist. And Jeremy is just going full bore. He's got this very funny monologue where he's like, I'm a dirty hobbit and she's a sexy elf. So she might be. And then he pitches up his voice and he's like, oh, you dirty hobbit, take off my bodkin and my jerkin. And then he just is going on and on about her sword. What if she's a hobbit slayer? And then there's this pause and he just goes, I'd use my enchanted amulet.
I mean,
and
he's just role-playing with himself. It's outstanding.
I know. And he's coming up with this story. He's literally typing with one hand.
Yeah.
It's a very funny scene.
No, definitely. So eventually, after Jeremy's little romp through Fantasyland there, he meets up with Superhands, and Superhands plays the bass track that was just so amazing.
I wasn't really a fan.
I'm not a fan either. Neither was Jeremy. Didn't like it as much as Superhands did. So Superhands immediately says, "Oh, okay. Well, this is the end of the Hair Blair bunch." Really,
but relax. It's not the end of the Hair Blair bunch. It is the end of Spunk Bubble.
But it's not really the end of Spunk Bubble either. It's actually the end of Mama's Kumquat.
And this is a funny scene with them arguing over the name of the band. Jeremy just basically tells Superhands, I bought all this equipment, and I need you to pay me for some of it.
Absolutely, and them arguing over the name of the band. I mean, throughout the series, there's probably 20 different names for the band.
Yes, there is,
and they're all fantastic. I would name a punk band anything that they throw out there, and it would be perfect. But so, yeah, basically they're arguing over the equipment, and Jeremy's kind of switching his role to kind of be the Mark of this situation, to where he's the one asking for money that he feels entitled to, and I don't think he really learns anything from it, but nevertheless, it's kind of weird to see him in that light.
Yeah, and then Superhands, as he's walking out, he does some little like probably high German like curse hand signal, and he just says, "Shit is as shit does." But before he can walk out, he gives it one last go, and he says, "Why are you breaking up the Hair Blair bunch?" And Jeremy just roars at him, "We are not the effing Hair Blair bunch." And then that's just kind of the end of the scene.
Yeah. Still, again, at the end of all that, still worried about the band name for a band that might not even exist.
And Jeremy, one thing that's also funny is that I think that he has been very rattled by Mark and the fact that he owes Mark money, because he is definitely not thinking about music right now.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. So the next scene, you've got back in Apollo House with Jeremy heading over to Tony's apartment to look for a fax machine so that he can fax over his application to JLB. Meanwhile, Mark is at JLB.
Yeah, and Jeremy goes next door to talk to Tony, and he hopes that she has the bong and not the coffee press, because it's probably been 3 hours since the last time Jeremy's done drugs. But this is where we start one of the funnier storylines in this entire episode with um, Tony, excuse me, is just talking about, oh, have you ever tried to do the washing up without any washing up fluid? And Jeremy is, very confused about this. Like, did Mark tell you something? Which I like that this absurd situation is something that Jeremy's actually done.
Absolutely, and it's weird because Jeremy knows that she's trying to pitch him a pyramid scheme, but he just kind of is going with it because again, if he hears something that he likes that sounds good, he just kind of sticks to it.
Well, he also doesn't really know what a pyramid scheme is either. He
That
just
also
thinks
helps.
he just thinks it's a great idea.
Yes, it could be Sensi, it could be Mary Kay, but in this case, it's just washing up liquid. Either way, Jeremy would definitely fall into that trap.
I like that she just reassures him like this is not pyramid selling, and she shows him a pie chart, and then she has this very very funny monologue where, um, and again we're kind of cropping all of Jeremy's scenes together in this, but she has this funny monologue where she talks about, oh, only the only the original people are going to make money, and she kind of points at her and Jeremy, and then she's like, we're going to be eating the pie, but all the Johnny come latelys, they're going to be eating pastries. And I think Jeremy is like legit excited about just making money doing nothing.
Yeah, absolutely, it's definitely a Jeremy thing. So that's pretty much all for Jeremy in that scene. So we're gonna go back to Mark, who's again at JLB working, just chugging down some chips at his desk.
Another little nerdy reference here where he calls his mouth the Sarlacc pit, and much like Boba Fett, he sends these little chips to their death.
Absolutely. And so Mark is, he's definitely shaken at this point, still over the cartoon, and he's just trying to relax and get some work done because he's kind of under a deadline to get some stuff done.
And he's trying everything to relax. He's trying not. He sees Sophie walk by, which kind of triggers him and gives him a little bit of a panic attack. And he's like squeezing the stress ball. He's like rearranging. He's obsessively rearranging his desk. I mean, it's a funny little bit where Mark is trying to relax and is just physically incapable of doing it.
Right. And so at the end of the day, he tries to remove the key out of his desk, which he says always gets stuck, and you can just hear the stress in his voice because of just everything else that's going on. So he's sitting there wrestling with the key. The key finally pops out, and then his attitude is just like, well, fuck it. The key always comes out. I don't need to get it fixed.
And he kind of just turns around and like there is Sophie standing right in front of him, and she says, I really liked your cartoon, Mark, and he's just like kind of shocked at this point, and he's like, you did? And she starts talking about how, oh, it's Barbara from HR and she's giving me a heart full of holiday pay, but really the heart is full of, she just pauses and Mark just goes, race hate.
Yes, exactly, because Sophie says that Barbara's such a racist, and
That's so Barbara.
yeah, and I think, I don't know, it's definitely a Mark thing to just blurt out something like race hate or whatever, just to try to, I don't know, not diffuse, because diffusing the situation would imply that he's not making it worse.
Yes, that was a good point.
And I'm not
I
sure.
was also going to say diffuse, but yeah, your point is much better.
So Mark then asks Sophie for her phone number, just in case Mark needs to get hold of her for any work-related things. Yeah, okay. So surprisingly, Sophie starts writing it down.
But Mark just can't be like a normal human being about it. Like he just has to. He first accuses her of not writing down enough numbers, but he is very quick to accuse her, and I think it throws her off a little bit. It's very funny, but it kind of throws her off a little bit, and then he has to quickly apologize, and then she just seems to kind of brush it off.
Yeah, she's kind of a sport about a lot of Mark's neuroses. Excuse
Neuroses.
me. She's a very good sport about it here at the beginning. So, and before the scene is over, Mark mentions he's thinking about his weird balls again, which
Yeah, he hopes that if things work out with him and Sophie, that he hopes she won't mind his weird balls, which is our second straight episode with a weird balls reference.
I think we go quite a few before we get a break from the weird balls, but
There's definitely one next week.
unfortunately, Mark never gets a break from his weird balls, so I guess we shouldn't complain. But next scene is Mark and Jeremy at Apollo House in the flat watching TV. And the quote, let's see here, it looks like they're watching some kind of murder mystery.
Yeah, I tried to look up what this show was by just kind of Googling the quote that's on the TV. But every time I Googled that, it just brought me to like a Peep Show related page. So it's hard to find what this actual show is, but it looks like some sort of murder mystery.
Right. And they're kind of trying to figure out, I guess, who did it. And, Jeremy just immediately says, well, it was him, and points to the black guy on TV. To which Mark says, "Oh, why? Because he's black, you racist." And it's funny because
yes,
I think that's something more that Jeremy would say.
Yes, yeah, it definitely is. I have often wondered in this scene if Mark is kind of throwing it in Jeremy's face a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
You know,
Get a taste of his own medicine.
Yeah, yeah, and this of course leads to Jeremy just, never wanting to be portrayed as a racist, just saying, no, because he was in the garage and had access to the keys, like he's got to justify himself to Mark.
Right. Now, during this exchange, sort of kind of in concert with it, Jeremy, I believe, challenges Mark to call Sophie, and they come to the conclusion that, okay, they're going to turn on Bob Ross, which again they call God for whatever reason. But if he's doing Mountain Sky or Water, he'll call, but Trees or Critters he won't. So they change the channel, and Bob Ross is painting sky, so it's time for him to call Sophie. Meanwhile, Jeremy is still on the race thing because, as it turns out, that guy did do the crime, and who's the racist now, Mark?
And then that, of course, leads into by far one of the best monologues in the entire Mark monologues, I should say, in this entire series. And I don't do David Mitchell's voice justice at all. So we're just going to go ahead and play the monologue for you, and then because it is very funny.
This now, Mark.
Sophie, if you heard that, please ignore it. I'm not a racist. Far from it. Anyway, it's good to hear your voice. I know it's only a recording, but you have got a bloody nice voice. And, God, I just called up to say hi, and then I go and spoil it all by saying something stupid like, I like you. I mean, not that. But anyway, I noticed that the paper in the photocopier is running a bit low, so I know it's not really your job, but, well, so, see you tomorrow.
Yeah, that's that's a good one. Yeah, I really enjoy that monologue because just when he's singing at the end and it's so awkward, and you can just hear the hesitation in his voice.
Yeah, he looks over at Jeremy, and Jeremy's face just sells the scene a million times. This scene is on YouTube, and I highly recommend to watch it as well as listen to it. But Jeremy's face just goes from like support for his friend for doing this, and then it turns into oh my god, and then it turns into horror, and then it just turns into complete revulsion in a 30-second span.
Which is probably how a lot of women feel about Mark. Surprised Sophie doesn't, especially after the message. I don't know, maybe she does, but yeah. So let's see here. So Mark has a lot of self-doubt over it, and yeah, he's kicking himself because he's just looking at Jeremy, and
if there's little kids in the car, cover their ears because this part has a lot of swearing. But he's just like, fuck, and the way that Jeremy responds, where he's just like, oh fuck.
Yeah, he's just kind of riffing off of it, and because Jeremy doesn't know what to say at that point. It was that bad.
It was literally that bad. I think Jeremy has probably never seen Mark at his worst.
That's pretty close. Pretty close.
Oh, oh,
Feeling bad about himself and Jeremy, I don't really know if he feels bad for Mark or if he's again repulsed, but either way, they both decide it's time for a little drinky poo. So they go to the bathroom with Mark sitting on the toilet drinking scotch, and Jeremy is just kind of lounging in the tub doing the same.
yeah, and Mark and Jeremy are talking about. Jeremy's like, well, maybe she'll find it charming, and Mark's just like, oh, she's gonna think I'm such a weirdo, and then Jeremy, trying to cheer up his buddy, is just like, no, not an oddball. You're a maverick. You may not play by the rules, but by Christ, you get results. And another little funny scene, and Jeremy can just tell that Mark is just despondent about this, and Mark and Jeremy are both very drunk in the bathroom at this point in time.
Yes. And of course, naturally, Jeremy trying to kind of, again, diffuse the situation or at least deflect a little bit, poses the question to Mark. Mark, have you ever tried to do the washing up without washing up liquid?
And then Mark just kind of looks at him very confused. Um, yeah, just looks at Mark just completely confused.
Yeah, and they have a little conversation about it, but Mark has pretty much already nailed it down. This is pyramid selling.
Yeah, and one thing that I also had forgotten to mention too is that the reason that Jeremy went over to Tony's originally was to use the fax machine, and she got in a nice roast on Jeremy about how, this isn't the 1980s anymore, and Jeremy was supposed to fax his application over to JLB.
Absolutely. So, Jeremy kind of Mark forces Jeremy to be realistic about the whole pyramid selling thing, but Jeremy's pretty convinced that what he's got is the way to go. He doesn't want Mark ruining his idea. So he's saying to himself, "Well, I'm going to come to the interview, but I don't think I'll be getting the job," and then laughs out loud inadvertently.
And Detective Mark is immediately on the case, and he's just like, "What's so funny?"
So the thing that I don't get is Tony did not have a fax machine,
That is correct. Tony did not have a fax machine,
but
but
somehow Jeremy got his application faxed over there.
yeah, I have never. This was not a plot hole that I even thought about until I watched it through this most recent time, where Mark very clearly tells him, like, you have to fax this over by 3. Jeremy very clearly does not fax it. Peep Show is one of those shows where important things do not happen on off screen. So Jeremy does not fax this application. Somehow he still has a job. I think that when we get Mitchell and Webb on this podcast, that is question number 1 that we should ask them.
Certainly, certainly. I think that really the first question, if Mitchell and Webb ever come on the podcast, is going to be, "What? Why the hell are you on our podcast?" Like,
Yes.
you have a lot of
Yes.
better things to do than talk to us.
Hey, but we're doing big things on SoundCloud. 40 listens each episode. I mean, pretty soon we'll be pulling in that cereal money.
Absolutely. Eat Alpin. So,
Yes.
the next scene, you got Mark coming into work at JLB, and it is Jeremy's interview day. But he is too worried about the message that he left for Sophie, and kind of, what if somebody else heard it? Maybe I could tell her that Jeremy held a gun to his head because he's a crackhead, but he doesn't want to make Sophie think that he lives in a crack den or anything like that.
Yeah, he doesn't want Sophie to be his crack bitch. She's just a nice, he worries that Sophie is, going to judge him based on, Jeremy being a crackhead. And this is also a very marked characteristic that you'll see throughout the series, where he plots different ways to throw Jeremy under the bus, and then sometimes does it, sometimes does not do it.
Right. In this case, he sees Sophie coming down the hallway towards him and ducks into the supply cupboard and just kind of hides in there, hoping that Sophie's going to pass. Unfortunately, you get to see Jeff open the door on Mark. And fuck Jeff, he's the worst.
Jeff is definitely the worst.
He's pretty much the villain of the entire series, and I just don't know how anybody can like Jeff.
It's weird because there's times where I really appreciate Jeff for the kind of drama that he adds, but there is no more punchable fictional character I've ever met than Jeff.
Like Jeff is, I don't know, not King Joffrey level, but he's up there.
He's very appropriately named because I've never met a cool Jeff.
Yeah. Unless you're listening to this podcast and your name is Jeff, in which case you're a pretty fucking cool guy.
Yeah, I'm sure any Jeff that listens to this podcast is a cool guy.
Absolutely. So Sophie sees Mark and Jeff talking and kind of Mark is confused why Mark would be hiding in the closet. To which
Do you think that it's possible? Do you want to entertain this idea that Jeff purposely that Jeff would not have cared about Mark hiding in the cupboard, but only opened the door solely to embarrass him in front of Sophie? Is this an idea that we even want to entertain on this show?
I think there's no question about it. Because Jeff is always kind of trying to sabotage Mark, and we see that in the next episode quite a bit.
Yeah, I definitely think it's possible that this whole situation was just a sabotage job.
I wouldn't doubt it. But so anyway, Mark's kind of yelling to Sophie, "Hey, we'll talk later about the message." Just very awkwardly, kind of trying to save any kind of face that he can, and there's really nothing to be saved here.
He also doesn't want to necessarily. I think he feels weird mentioning this in front of Jeff, because he really does hate Jeff, and I think that if had Mark thought it through, he probably wouldn't have mentioned this, because I'm sure Jeff's next question to Sophie was like, "What the hell is he talking about?"
And probably was, as we discover later. But Jeff finally kind of just grabs something out of the closet and closes the door, at which point you hear a screaming torrent of self-loathing and despair from Mark.
Yeah, it's a very funny scene where it's very muffled what's coming out of the closet, but just by the way that Sophie and Jeff look at each other, it's not good.
So the next interview is...
You know what I just realized in that scene?
What's that?
Whose point of view are we looking through?
Well, I think most of it you're looking through Mark's.
Not after he closes the door, because he's in the closet, and
maybe Sophie's, because I think it's Sophie looking at Jeff, who's looking.
I'm gonna rewatch the scene later, but I almost am positive that it's the two of them standing to the left and the right of the door. This is a mystery. We're gonna solve this mystery, and we're gonna talk about it next week.
All right, let's do that. So, next scene, we get to the title of the episode, basically, the thing that we've been waiting for the whole time, Jeremy's interview with Barbara at JLB. Unbeknownst to Jeremy, though, Mark is also going to be in attendance at the interview.
And Jeremy's whole goal is to just sabotage the hell out of this interview. I mean, he's dressed, his suit looks like it's too big, he looks disheveled. He mentions to the racist Barbara that he's still drunk from the night before. And, Barbara, I feel like, is a little oblivious to what Jeremy is trying to do, or she's just trying to kind of play off on it. And then she introduces Jeremy to Mark, and Jeremy all of a sudden realizes, oh, I can't really throw this interview anymore.
Yeah, and I think Barbara might have just been displaying, because realistically, at that point, he's not going to get the job. Probably nobody who's ever gone into a job interview purposely trying to sabotage themselves has ever even come close to getting a job like that. But it could just be British politeness, as to where in America, an HR person would just say, "Are you, what's wrong with you? Get out."
Yeah, that's always a distinct possibility as well, because Barbara, despite being a racist, is very nice to Jeremy.
Yes. So Jeremy is, like Sean said, he's kind of trying to act proper and normal and not make it completely obvious that he's flubbing the interview. And Jeremy just pretty much tunes out the whole interview with Barbara, but yet he still seems to be coming up with responses that don't sound horrible.
This is another funny scene where Barbara is just talking and she starts to ask him a question, and then Jeremy just sort of tunes out, focusing solely on Mark, and again Barbara's voice gets kind of muted and distorted, and you just get this Jeremy monologue where he's thinking about Mark. And you also get another monologue in the scene where Mark is talking about how he could order Jeremy to file this and pick up that and suck this, and he just gets this Jesus, where did that one come from?
Yeah, there's some, and we see it later in the season. There's some latent questioning within Mark, which it makes for some funny scenes. So Barbara has her little checklist there, and it's got, what is it, like a column that says acceptable or poor, and poor is checked all the way down the line. There's no way he's getting the job.
Yeah, he's not. He's
So
sorry. He's not winning any favors, but he's actually answering the questions quite well. Where he says something along the lines of, "I'm looking for something that's more of a organizing, but in a professional environment. I mean sphere." And he makes like this circle with his hands, and he has another one where he talks about how despite being a nurse, that this job would be a relaxing challenge for him. And it's Jeremy just is so, he's so proud of himself for throwing this interview in the best way he can, but then he's also just turning on his charisma to like 11.
right, so in compensation for that, he just starts like faking facial spasms at Barbara, which, immediately Mark calls him out on. You don't have facial spasms, stop it. And then they just pretty much get into an argument. Jeremy tries to kind of deflect the argument by asking Barbara, have you ever tried to do the washing up without any washing up liquid?
And Mark just gets like completely livid at this point and is just yelling at him about pyramid scheming and or spelling, and he is just apologizing profusely to Barbara, and Barbara just seems like completely thrown off as to what is going on in the room at that point in time.
Well, yeah, because they start arguing, and Jeremy brings up the supposed porn that he found in Mark's room, saying, well, at least I don't fancy elves and pixies.
Do you think Mark's reaction here is legit, where like, do you really think he potentially viewed these as like an erotic thing, or do you think this was more Mark just being a nerd?
Oh, I think it's Mark being a nerd. I mean, painting figs is definitely something that Mark, it seems like he would do. But
Well, he did have a D&D box in his closet that we saw when Jeremy was looking through it, and made me wonder, you never see Mark like ever embrace this like hardcore nerd side of his personality.
well, you start to see it in like what, season 5, season 6 maybe, but not.
Where he does play a World of Warcraft-esque game, and that's in that time everybody was playing World of Warcraft, so
Yeah, unfortunately. But we had some good times. So anyway, we get the next scene where Mark is at JLB talking to Sophie about the interview, just how much of a disaster it was, and it really was terrible.
and we're about to have an even better terrible disaster coming up here shortly.
Yes, Mark I don't know what he's thinking. So Sophie mentions that she met Jeremy on his way out of the building, thought he was a funny guy. So all of a sudden, Mark has this twinge of, okay, are we, kind of rivals again? So he immediately tries to throw Jeremy under the bus, which is his knee-jerk default reaction.
Yeah.
Anytime Jeremy might be getting a leg up on him.
Yeah, very funny scene here.
So Sophie is pretty much just like, Mark asks about the message, and Sophie's kind of fluffing him and just, no, the message was fine, and, I didn't tell anybody about it. And Mark finally admits to her, well, I suppose I like you. And she says, oh, okay, I think I can deal with that.
But then he's just got to take it one step further, and he fires off with, I like you, and if you can't handle it, then fuck off.
Yeah, I mean, just fantastic. Again, if you've ever used that to successfully seal the deal, please let us know. But something tells me that, it didn't even really work for Mark here. So, yeah. Anyway, so we get, next scene is the JLB lobby with Mark and Barbara and Jeff and the crippled kid from the first scene that we briefly touched on. And the kid is walking completely normally through the hallway, gives Mark the old 2 fingers, and Mark just proceeds to rip into this kid.
And one thing that I didn't realize before is when Mark is in the interview with Barbara and Jeremy, and Jeremy's doing the facial spasm thing, he accuses Jeremy of faking it and berates him right in front of Barbara, Barbara the racist, who's their HR director, and then in front of her again, he yells at this kid and accuses this kid of faking an injury. So like she must think that he's just absolutely insane and that he just accuses people of faking disabilities all the time.
Yeah, he might be the most unable person in any given situation, but yeah, at least socially. So they're getting on the elevator, and who's in the elevator? Fucking Jeff.
Yeah, goddamn Jeff.
I hate Jeff. So Jeff's just kind of standing there with a shitty grin on his face, pretty much ignoring Mark.
Yeah, and Mark is, trying to make small talk, and Jeff is just not having any of it, and Mark is just, well, screw you if you aren't making small talk. And this is when we get the reveal that Sophie really has told other people about the message, because Jeff just looks at Mark and starts singing something stupid, which is exactly what Mark had saying to Sophie on his voicemail.
Yep, and that is the end of the episode, and we cut to the credits. And again, much better than the first episode as far as, comedy-wise. I mean, there's a lot of good content in here.
Yeah, I think you start to see a more formed Mark where his internal and external voices are more consistent with each other.
I think so, and just some of the scenes, like the Jeremy with the magazine it's one of my favorite scenes in the whole series. I just really enjoy it.
Yeah, it's a very funny scene, and I even showed it to my wife just because I was trying to explain this scene to her, and my wife is not the biggest fan of more dirty humor like this, and she even thought this scene was funny. She loved Jeremy referring to it as a bodkin and a jerkin, and
just so proper.
So proper.
But yeah, great episode, and actually the next one we have coming up is definitely my favorite episode of season 1. I know it's Sean's favorite episode of season 1, and probably a top 5 in the entire series, which is called On the Pole. And the characters really start to come out in this episode, I think. Like, the form that you see in this episode is what you're going to see for most of the rest of the series.
Yes, this next episode has some very high highs and some very low lows, and I'm really excited to talk about it. I mean, I'm prepared for that podcast to go an hour and a half.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it. We're definitely going to be taking one more look at it before we do, just to make sure that we hit everything, because there's so much in it. But in the meantime, we are now officially on TuneIn. So if you have an Amazon Echo or any Alexa-enabled device, you can ask it to listen to the El Dude Brothers podcast. The Alexa didn't really respond the first time. I think it wanted to point me to the El Do You Brothers podcast. We don't do that sort of thing here.
Do know you brothers? No.
Something like that. It was weird. But eventually she will play the podcast for you, which is kind of neat to be able to listen just off of the Echo device. It's a really neat thing. And, hopefully we can just keep up this positive momentum. Hopefully the 40 people listening, this isn't some weird chat roulette scenario where they just really, really like our voices, and hopefully people are actually enjoying the content. Certainly, if you have any questions, comments, anything like that, please visit us on our Facebook page, WordPress, Tumblr, Twitter. I know some of them are a little bit underdeveloped, but we will be working on those in the weeks to come.
Yeah, and I just want to give a couple shout-outs to some people on SoundCloud. I want to give a shout-out to people who have followed us, like Greg with 2 Gs, Paul, and my personal favorite, which is user 991495623, which is definitely not like some sort of weird porn account.
No, I mean, usually when I see a cover photo or profile picture that's just a butt, what I don't know.
Her name is Maud Bush, and she's from Lithuania, so she is definitely not a potential mail order wife.
No, absolutely not. So Maud, thank you so much for following, as well as Greg. And, we hope that y'all enjoyed listening to this week's episode. Again, we apologize for being a little bit disjointed, and because we've kind of had to piece the episode together in our own more organized way than what the episode is viewed in. But next week should be a little bit easier to get through, and definitely just such a great episode. So
one last thing, and this is probably in the future. This might be crazy, but we're very excited with how many people are listening to us on SoundCloud. If you listen to us on iTunes or Google Play, the Google Play Music Store, please take just 5 seconds, give us a like, give us a comment. Really helps us out a lot. And if anybody ever wants to email us, you can email us at ldudebros, BROS podcast @gmail.com. And you can also find us on Twitter at ldudebropod. So please follow us on Twitter, send us an email. We would love to eventually have a comments and question section at the end.
Even if you're just telling us how terrible we are, we'd still love to hear about it. So in the meantime, I guess that's it for this week, and we will see you next time here on the L Dude Brothers podcast.
I know I stand in line until you think you have the time to spend an evening with me.